Think of our voices as your own.
Hello everybody and welcome to Inquiry, the Philosophy Society's podcast. This happens to be our maiden attempt. So thank you, Dr. Valentine, for accepting to be our guinea pig, essentially.
No problem.
Dr. Valentine is an assistant professor, if I got it right.
That is correct.
Yeah, at Troy University. He specializes in Buddhist studies and Tibetan Buddhism. He also happens to know the Tibetan language. What is that, by the way?
The Tibetan language?
Yes, what's it called?
It is called Tibetan.
Oh, okay, that was easy enough. Yes. So.
Actually, in Tibetan, you would say Puryik or Purget. Puryik would be Tibetan that's written, and Purget is Tibetan that is spoken. And I'm actually more of a specialist of Puryik, which is the written version.
So there's a huge difference between the two. To the meat of why you're here, though,
Indeed.
as it suggests, for the people back home, people who happen to be listening, imagine us having coffee. There's a bunch of us around this room. I believe 6 of us in total. Just imagine us having a conversation over a cup of coffee or beer, if that's your thing. That's the ambience we're trying to set. That's probably what you should also assume, Dr. Valentine, even if we haven't provided you with any condiments. Yeah.
Okay.
Have you settled into that mood?
I am ready.
Okay. So being a white guy, which you are, I believe.
The last time I checked, yes, this was the case.
Okay. So being a white guy, what led you to Buddhism? Because it is on that side of the planet. You're way over here.
Right, yeah. So it's somewhat of I'm sure it's not that unique of a passage that got me there, but during my undergraduate degree at University of Delaware, I really had no idea what I was doing and why I was there. As I've told many of my classes before, the main reason that I went to college was because I took a look around in my hometown and I saw that everybody who stayed in my hometown after high school, that they were all working in restaurants, pretty much as cooks. All the guys were cooks, and they were all fighting over about 3 different girls. And so I said, well, I think I should go to college. And so I did. So quite obviously, when I got there, I had no idea what I wanted to study. And I spent a year doing computer science, programming in languages that were already dead at that period of time, and this wasn't doing it for me. And somewhere along the line, I dropped a course. I think it was in archaeology, and I needed to add another one, and my roommate said, hey, why don't you come to my philosophy class? So I did, and it was the first time in college that I actually wanted to say something in a class. And so I was sold right away. Next semester, I took world religions, which is also in the philosophy department at University of Delaware. And the teacher was just amazing, this guy named Dr. Fox. He's actually still one of my sort of mentors to this day. And he took us through every one of the religions, or not everyone, but every one of the big religions. And I liked each one even more than the next. And then we got to Buddhism, and I said, aha, this is amazing. I love this. And originally I fell in love with it because I felt it was the most logically sound. It took the fewest amount of leaps and so forth. I wouldn't say that it necessarily characterizes my understanding of Buddhism today, but definitely when I first encountered it, I felt like Buddhism had answers that I hadn't heard at other places.
Just bringing you back just a bit, you did say that you liked the other religions as they were presented to you, and then you found Buddhism and you liked it more. But so it's safe to assume that you liked the other religions as well. You found them appealing, if not equally appealing. You still found them appealing.
Yeah, that is the case. However, it's also with my unique history. I did spend 5 years in Catholic school, where we were literally beat by nuns. In fact, I will never forget. I'm 44 now, and I still remember from first, second, third, fourth, and fifth grade. Sister Saint Richard. Yes, nun with
Is it
a.
okay to say names now?
Oh yeah, and she's long since fired. But so Sister St. Richard, in her office behind her, there was this fake fireplace with a real mantle, and hanging from it like Christmas stockings were paddles. And each one was like, as long as my arm, at least then, with these big flow holes in it so that when you smacked somebody, they wouldn't, go off course. And I met the business end of that more than once.
But then you didn't seem to resent Christianity.
Oh, no, I most certainly did for a long time. And I think that is why I needed to experience some other religions. However, a very interesting thing happened when I finally got to Naropa University, where I did my master's in Buddhist studies. One of the very first days there, we watched this lecture. It was the inaugural address to Naropa University that had been recorded in the 70s by the Tibetan Buddhist monk named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who founded the university, of course, along with Allen Ginsberg. At any rate, he gave this talk, and the first thing he said is, and he's sort of a straight talker, and in his really high-pitched voice, he said, and I'm summarizing, "What's the matter with you, students, is that you don't respect tradition." And he was right that, one of our issues at the time is we didn't really respect our own traditions. We were busy trying to reject them without seeing what they had to offer.
I'm pretty sure most of us in this room are guilty of the same thing, of trying to reject our traditions, right?
Yes.
And so you wouldn't be necessarily alone there.
No, in fact, I think there's a whole class of people out there that are called recovering Catholics. I meet them. I meet them all the time.
So recovering how? Recovering from Catholicism or recovering to?
I'd say both happen for sure. Yeah. I mean, sometimes people are looking for, other answers and other ways of being religious. So they go check out other religions. But also, even sometimes within the Catholic tradition itself, there's a wide range of voices there. I mean, obviously, the current Pope, just the other day, he evidently, I've only seen this secondhand, said it's better to be an atheist than a bad Christian. So, the current Pope is pretty wild. Another one of my favorite things is recently he said that you will see your pets in heaven. Which, of course, all the theologians are like, what? What does that mean? Do dogs have souls? Yeah. And if they don't, does that mean we're going to be in heaven in spirit form? But
if they do, can you still kill them?
And so we're going to be in heaven in spirit form, but dogs will be there in bodily form. Like, how does that work? Can you still play fetch? I mean, there's a lot of problems that would result from that.
But still, veering back, since what we want to do is know more about you rather than your apt descriptions of Catholicism. Walk me through what happened when you first, when you first encountered Buddhism, like your first class. You mentioned you had a mentor who went into a spiel about Buddhism. Yeah,
I mean, as is typical, probably in the 90s and maybe even still now.
You went to college in the 90s?
Yes, way back then. Okay. So I probably had that world religions class in maybe 92, maybe 93. But at the time, it was very common to emphasize only the philosophical, the theological aspects of Buddhism and really skip over all the rest. And so from a purely philosophical perspective, I found like the Four Noble Truths, the 12 Nidanas, etc. I found those to be, very, very satisfying explanations of the types of problems I was having. And I liked the fact that the answers were things like meditate that I could do on my own that didn't need to be mediated really by somebody else. Although meditating based on your own directions might not always be the best thing.
What sort of problems were you having that needed to be addressed by Buddhism? Because besides paddles with holes in them, because I think a lot of us, when you start talking about that, there were some nods around the room. We've all had some encounters like that, and in our schooling, especially via like religious schools. So what problems did you have that needed to be reconciled with Buddhism?
I can't say I have too many specifics then. We're talking about 20-some years ago, or is it more? Is it 30? 20-some years ago, about what the problems were then. And yeah, I mean, just in general, I do think that at that point in time, I was very aware of the fact that a large amount of my suffering was self-inflicted, right? That it's the way that I approached things that was causing me to suffer. If I went out with friends, I'd be more likely to be the person who was melancholy while everybody else was like, woohoo, this is great. And so I felt that Buddhism had, some sort of answers there. But, as it turns out, and I guess this is where the conversation is going, is Naropa University, we do study Buddhism from a very sort of philosophical, theological perspective, and there's a ton of meditation. You have to take a full 3-credit course in meditation every semester for 2 years. And you have to do a 30-day meditation retreat in order to get the degree. And you're supposed to meditate a minimum of 4 hours a week all through the whole 2 years. And last but not least, they have what's called practice week every semester. So literally in the middle of every single semester, classes are canceled for a week. And you're supposed to meditate the length of time that equals the number of credits you're taking. So for instance, my second year, I was taking 18, 19 credits, and you had to do that, So at any rate, I did find a lot of satisfaction out of that. I felt some answers were, if I came to some answers at that period of time.
I don't know if I'm hearing this right, but you got a degree for essentially sitting alone in a corner and just keeping to yourself. No tests, nothing, just, sitting alone in a corner.
No, there most certainly were tests. There was a lot of intellectual content that goes along with learning meditation. So for instance, in each one of those meditation courses, we probably had 3 or 4 different meditation manuals that we had to read and master the materials. And then in addition to that, you would meditate with the whole group, maybe like 25, 30 people with a teacher guiding you. And then you also had a personal meditation instructor who you would meet with one-on-one, talk about the sort of more nitty-gritty problems that you were having. But yeah, sure, grading somebody in a meditation course is a little bit difficult, right? Like, you didn't achieve enlightenment, you fail, right? So that's problematic. But then the other courses were, much more grit to them as far as reading and learning concepts and stuff, right? So semester 1, you do first turning Buddhism, semester 2, second turning, and then the whole second year, you're learning about sort of Tantra and Buddhism in Tibet. And there's a ton of content there that you can be quizzed and examined on just like any other program.
When you say you sat alone and meditated, and then you talk about you needing someone to be there with you to address one-on-one issues, the nitty-gritty, as you called it, I don't think I quite understand, because how I'm viewing this is you having troubles, having to sit in a corner, not bothering anybody, and needing someone to resolve those issues. Sounds to me like you were getting treatment for neurosis rather than, a degree in philosophy.
Well, there were 2 aspects of the coursework, right? So you're taking 15 credits. Only 3 of the credits are the meditation courses. So then you're taking a couple other courses that are normal seminars where you're reading through philosophy books and discussing the philosophy in classes. And then I was also doing Tibetan language the first year. And then the summer in between the 2 years, I taught myself first year Sanskrit. And then the second year, I took a full 3-credit course every semester in Tibetan and 1 in Sanskrit for both semesters. So the academic rigor part was there for sure. But also, I guess I haven't impressed upon you quite yet exactly how difficult meditation can be. Although I have heard tale recently of a student who has developed ear problems as a result of meditating.
I can neither confirm nor deny that statement. But essentially, though, I understand that meditation might be hard, but I still don't quite appreciate it. In that, I would rather you tell me how hard it was for you internally. Why was it hard?
Uh, there's a variety of reasons. I mean, one is just simply that you, generally speaking, especially somebody like me at the time, where you're in grad school, in order to go on to get a PhD, you're very much thinking about the outcome of all this, right? Like the whole time I'm doing this this master's degree, even though I'm trying to be in the moment and meditate, I'm also thinking I've got to get A's in all these classes because I want to get funding to go on and do a PhD, right? I knew I couldn't afford to pay for the PhD myself. So in general, my whole method and mode of being in the world is at every moment you have to be trying to get something out of something and force it and accomplish and move on. And to a certain degree in meditation, you have to completely give up those sorts of objectives in order to meditate, dare I say, properly.
Well, Doctor, kind of piggybacking off what you were saying, how much of this goes over into your class and what you teach?
I don't know. Ask it again in order to give me a chance to think about it.
Okay, I know that our philosophy department here is fairly new, and y'all are trying to establish y'all's own kind of form here.
That's
so
correct.
What would y'all's form be here at Troy University, considering the philosophy?
Very good question. Well, I think when they hired us, they intentionally picked two people who would complement each other. Not meaning we wouldn't insult each other, but in the sense that we have different emphases. And so the things that he's interested in are things that I'm not interested in. I respect them as legitimate fields of study, etc.
Did I just want you to talk about what he is interested in briefly?
And maybe say his name.
Okay, so to the best of my knowledge, the esteemed Dr. Lim is interested in, first of all, the Western tradition of analytical philosophy. And it proceeds largely through formalized argument. And in addition to that, I would say he's very interested in philosophy of religion. Somebody help me out. What is a common question that one might ask in the philosophy of religion?
Does God exist?
Was there an answer, or did they just ask the question?
No, they tell us different ways on how to ponder the question, but I don't think he gave us a conclusive answer. So.
Okay, sure. So that's sort of philosophy of religion, analytical philosophy, and so forth. For me, first and foremost, I study Asian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, of course, and there's a wide range of that. So Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, to a certain degree, their philosophies I find extremely interesting. I think very often I would say with their rigor and their depth of seriousness, etc., that they stand toe-to-toe with Western philosophy that was, that originated hundreds of years after it. So I think it's sophisticated and it's been around for a long time. So I like it in a lot of different ways because of that. And then also when we talk about Western philosophy, I tend to like continental philosophy more than the Anglo-American analytical philosophy.
Why do you say that? Why do you like continental philosophy more than, analytical philosophy?
Well, because it's, they get better answers. They seem to be correct, whereas the analytical philosophers go like way off the deep end.
But I mean, I know you're trying to be humorous and maybe intentionally belligerent, but I want an actual answer though, and maybe something that is rooted in you. Why do you have this preference?
So obviously I was being sarcastic. Analytical philosophy is great. And, first of all, as an educator, I'm very aware of the fact that not every type of philosophy speaks to every student. Also, if you are going to go into something like law after your degree in philosophy, your minor in philosophy, I would say take all the analytical philosophy courses that are offered. Take every single one. I think it's very good for the human mind, the intellect, etc. That being said, it's just not what I want to spend my time reading. I find it, not as interesting as some of the other things. So, for instance, with the continental philosophers, one thing, for instance, you have is discussion of ideas through novels, for instance. And there's just something in that method of encasing the ideas in living situations, etc., that I think for me works better and gets me to, I don't know, feel like something significant has happened with my understanding of things that I don't quite get just from analyzing arguments in isolation from things.
I mean, of course, if I am qualified to make a response, I'm going to assume I am, even if I'm not. Continental philosophy is romantic in a sense, maybe, in that Nietzsche or Camus or Kafka, Dostoevsky, whoever else, Sartre, and even the entirety of existentialism, right, is rooted in a romantic notion of the self and what it is to be human, right? Analytical philosophy makes no such prior assumptions, and so analytical philosophy therein cannot hit an emotional chord with you, right? And
yeah, I mean, I would say I understand that perspective, and I would agree to a certain point. And I think continental philosophy's response is that in analytical philosophy, very often the subject isn't there at all. It very often seems to be proceeding from the perspective of, not really recognizing the connection between the subject and object, which is, I think, sort of fundamental for continental philosophy. This notion that there's no such thing as objective truth, that there's always a subject that's interceding, calling certain things special and relevant, etc. And I'm not actually saying that that's not there in analytical philosophy. I think it's got to be there somewhere. But the emphasis really isn't on that. And so I think part of it is the content, but part of it is also the style. I don't know if I agree with the romantic thing, though. I don't know. Do I come off as a romantic?
Somewhat. You got this whole aesthetic that just looks like you're ready to recite some poetry, and some good poetry at that. Doc, if you don't mind...
Are you alleging he looks like a hippie?
No. Very distinguished professor. Look, he's got going. If you don't mind, we have a few students here that would love to ask you some questions, if we can start that.
All right.
Part of the Buddhist philosophy is this idea that there's a lack of intrinsic value and inner emptiness, if you will. And how do you reconcile this as an educator, or do you rather use your position as an educator to try and help fulfill others' emptiness? Do you use it to fulfill your own, or the students, or both? Do you use it as a mutually beneficial relationship between educator and student?
So,
if you subscribe to that portion of Buddhism at all.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the basic idea of the absence of inherent nature, especially when you're talking about concepts, and even more so when you're talking about social concepts, right? Like the idea that there's something really that makes a cow a cow. Okay, fine, whatever. There's not really a lot at stake there. Whatever you call...
There's a lot of stake there.
A lot of stake there. Yeah, but whatever you're going to call that heifer, it doesn't really matter in the end if you can raise it properly, get milk from it, etc., right? So, but especially when we get to social concepts and asking whether or not, and ethical concepts, and asking whether or not they also have some sort of inherent element to them, that's usually where I would sort of disagree. For instance, like even with something like religion, if you study religion, one of the first things you learn, academic study of religion, is we don't have a definition of religion, because it's kind of, the boundaries of it are something we're changing and making up all the time. And even in the West, Derrida, for instance, another French continental philosopher, has this whole same conversation about the absence of presence, which is what he's really getting at is the same thing. Is if you look at any of these important social concepts, even like, say, justice, and you look at it hard enough and you really examine it, there ends up being no essential core to the concept that remains constant in all the different uses of it.
With the lack of this intrinsic value, I think it's hard for a lot of Westerners, especially down here in the Bible Belt, to reconcile purpose. So with a lack of self and a lack of internal or intrinsic value, rather. A lot of people have trouble reconciling that with any divine inspiration or finding a purpose in their life. How do you answer that?
First of all, good question. And I think this goes back to what Jeremiah was saying, which is about, how do you give meaning to people, etc. And just to be clear, that what is meant by emptiness doesn't mean that there wouldn't be any meaning to life. It's just that whatever it is that you find valuable would be changing. It would have parts. It wouldn't be something that would have a stable center to it. That being said, the whole other question of inspiration and making life meaningful, it really depends on what type of person you are. If you're somebody who does believe in the Bible as literally true, which lots of people do, and that's great, you're already living in a world that you've agreed to allow to have some pretty amazing meanings. And so you don't really need necessarily to look for a meaning outside of that. If you don't have that, which again, many people don't accept the Bible just as complete literal truth, then there is a lot of leeway as to what you're going to decide the meaning of life is, the meaning of personhood, etc. And the most common answer that I've come across that I seem to like the most usually is the idea of re-enchantment. If you can think of it in one way, that our lives used to be enchanted because we didn't know what was going on. And then science disenchanted life to a certain degree. And then we ended up with a really boring life to a certain, one way of looking at it. And so now we're intentionally re-enchanting life. We're intentionally making it more interesting because we want to. And that can sometimes be in total disregard of what the truth is. What would you rather have? An interesting life that might be founded on some imaginary things, or a boring life that is just 100% the hard facts and nothing else?
Well, I don't think the hard facts are ever really boring. They do seem, and I think that they provide the utmost awe and don't really take anything away from the value of life.
Yeah, so I would agree with that in the academic sense and the university sense, right? I mean, you're in a setting where you're supposed to go in and question the premises and get in and look at the nuts and bolts of things. For instance, in our introduction to philosophy class, is anybody in there? Nobody in here is in that class. We're reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance as one of the main textbooks for the class. And in there, he goes into philosophy of science. And of course, it's done in a novel, so maybe I find it to be romantically engaging. I don't know. But what he points out there is that we tend to think of science as being really dry and all these sort of, funny-looking people wearing white jackets. But in the end, the main part of the scientific method is hypothesis. And if you're doing science right, you end up with more and more and more hypotheses as you go along. So really, the inquiry expands through scientific investigation instead of being cut off. So from that perspective, I would agree. I think what I'm getting at is as folks that just buy the products and cut off the inquiry. Like, come on, most people have no idea what's going on inside the engine of a car, right? They don't know the magic that's going on inside the hood. So we're cut off from a lot of the details. But again, with this idea of re-enchantment, I think the good thing to look at with this would be the carnival, right? Or carnival, where you would intentionally put on the outfit of the dragon, etc., and parade around, even though we no longer believe the dragon's real. But we want for that enchantment to be in life because it's I don't know, more satisfying than the world where you don't have that.
Just going off sort of on a tangent, but not exactly. Since we're on this topic of enchantment, a lot of people from the outside, at least, perceive Buddhism to be nihilistic, right? Which was evident in the questions about not having meaning and how that influences life, etc. Would you say that Buddhism is strictly nihilistic, or would you say those are two entirely different philosophies?
Yeah, very good question. And especially, and Buddhists are aware of this, that since that one of the main concepts is called emptiness, it tends to lead people to the conclusion of thinking that nothing matters, nothing exists, etc. And it's really much more of a refined philosophical concept than that. They're really trying to explain that there's a particular type of existence, and in particular, they mean permanent, unified, what's the other one? Permanent, unified, independent, etc. And that is the thing that things are empty of, which again is sort of a delicate philosophical point. However, life is profoundly meaningful from the Buddhist perspective, and sort of what I was getting at along the way is that the philosophical side of Buddhism is really only one. It's one significant, but it's one small aspect of what Buddhism is overall in the world. Like if you go to a country that is Buddhist, if you go to a typical Buddhist country, it's not like everybody's hanging out meditating. The vast majority of Buddhists do not meditate. There are many other life pathways that are going to be unique to the individual tradition. And that's sort of where I've transitioned to now. I still find the meditation and the philosophy interesting, but all the other aspects of Buddhist culture, particularly Tibetan Buddhist culture, is really what drives me academically now.
If you then make a distinction between Buddhism as a philosophy and Buddhism as a lifestyle, maybe you can clarify when you answer, but essentially though, Buddhism as a philosophy then seems like a truism. How really does it affect your life? Because scientists say that if scientists came out and said that we don't have free will, right? It doesn't really affect our lives much because we will still interact much the same way. And so if things don't have permanent substance to them, right? But you allege that we can still interact much the same way, then it doesn't necessarily affect your life.
Well, that to make that connection is actually where meditation is supposed to come into play, or also practicing one of the other what's called paramitas in Mahayana Buddhism, which is essentially practicing one of the other virtues. So, for instance, one of the virtues is meditation, and in that, the basic idea, and I know you know this from the class, you're just trying to get me to say it, is that this notion of this misunderstanding of what reality is and misunderstanding of what we are as individuals is in Buddhism intimately linked to human suffering, unnecessary human suffering. We're actually both forms, necessary and unnecessary forms of human suffering. So all the stress that you have before an exam, yes, that is something your professor is doing to you, but no, not really. Actually, it is something that you're deciding to allow yourself to suffer over. And if you change the way that you think about yourself and the world, you will no longer thus suffer. So that's the main thing. But about the thing about Buddhism being a way of life, this comes up all the time. And I don't know who said it. I can't claim coming up with this one, but there's really no religion out there that wouldn't claim to be a way of life. Like Christianity doesn't say, you should be Christian on Sundays from 9 till 11 or 9 to 12, and the rest of the time you go about your capitalistic life. The ideal way things would happen is you would bring Christianity into the entirety of your life, and it would be your way of life, right? So Buddhism is the same sort of way. It's not just a philosophy. It is supposed to affect you overall. Now, of course, Buddhism has greatly affected me because studying it is what led to my PhD and then having this job. So I can't imagine a world being different or any more different if I hadn't studied Buddhism.
Right. We might be out of time or approaching the time limit.
I think we are indeed running low on time.
But for one final thought, though, if there is one quote or one sentence or one paragraph or one idea that affected you the most, it doesn't even have to be Buddhism, but it would be swell if it were. What would you say that one thing was, and when did that happen? Like, when did you first encounter that idea or phrase or I think I've bought you enough time with synonyms. So
yeah, right. Thanks
you should
for,
probably
thanks
respond.
For trying. I can't say I have a single quotation that sort of like fundamentally rocked my world. It's more, for me, it's more of the sum total of things that have sort of changed me, And by the way, in a way, we
That
could
sounds
say
like a cop-out answer.
it is, but maybe in a sense, it comes back to a difference between analytical and continental philosophy. When I started studying, for instance, Hegel, I was trying to go sentence by sentence. And so I went to the professor and I said, look, I'm going sentence by sentence here, and I'm trying to understand every sentence as I go along. I don't get it. What's going on? And he said, well, first of all, stop that. Just read the whole thing, and then read something else by Hegel, and read something else by Hegel, and eventually the gaps will be filled in, and you'll understand what he's talking about. But you can't really proceed by sort of the foundationalist methodology of one thing at a time, and then you get there, right? It's sort of like a sum total of things. So I think in general, I work more that way. I don't think that there's any one thing somewhere that has completely rocked my world to sort of send me in the direction that I'm in now. But yeah.
But would you say that professor sent you on that direction, though?
Dr. Fox, way back at University of Delaware?
Well, him, but the professor who you went to with Hegel.
Not so much. I think
You did quote him on your idea, so I'm gonna take it and run away with it.
Yeah, I mean, when I was forced to come up with a relevant thing, that's what I came up with. So, yeah, no, I'd say if we're looking for something that was influential, instead of like a one sentence, but maybe a moment or a series of moments, then I would go back to that world religions class at University of Delaware, and just sort of the sum total of going through and getting to sample the wisdom of a variety of different cultures and different religions, one after another. I think the sum total is really what sent me in the direction that I've gone. And I should point out that even though my specialty is Tibetan Buddhism, my PhD is in religious studies, writ large. So general methodologies for the study of religion, and then teaching a wide variety of religions is really, probably the most satisfying part of the content that I teach.
What do you want your student that isn't a philosophy minor or major to take from your class when he takes it? If he's just taking a regular intro class to fulfill some elective, what do you want him to walk away with?
A good question. I would say depth and authenticity, really. Is the type of person who hasn't really thought about anything yet, in any kind of deeper way. I want to give students the opportunity to stop and think and reflect. In the Intro to Philosophy class, for instance, they have a philosophy journal, and they keep asking me, what do you want for there to be in the journal? And there's no answer to that. You need to reflect. I can't determine what's going to show up when you start reflecting on things, right?
True.
But you need to have that time. If you're going to write Dear Journal or whatever, you need to have some time where you reflect on things, and this will help you develop depth as a person. And then I think what comes with that is some authenticity, where you've really thought about what you want to do, what you actually enjoy, come up with a shtick for your academic studies, some subject that really does it for you, that you want to organize everything you do around that subject. Those things, I think, help you become more of your own person, right?
Awesome.
Think of the self, even though Buddhists would say it doesn't truly exist. But that's good actually for what I'm saying, which is that the self is the ultimate art project. You're going to spend your whole life building the unique self. It's not like one was given to you when you got here and it doesn't change. And to take some agency, I own this self because I've shaped it in a way that I wanted it to be.
And you mentioned agency. Do you agree that we have free will?
Where is it?
Yeah, where is it? Where's this tangible free will?
We should act as if we have free will.
I agree.
Even if we don't. Yeah.
I just spoke up saying that I was one of those students that just taking your class as a general elective, and I certainly hope that I've gained depth from the classes I've took with you, as well as ethics with Dr. Lim.
Right on. Well, good to hear.
Thanks for joining us, Dr. Valentine. I hope we didn't bore you too much.
Of course, you didn't bore me. It was very interesting, and it was a great experience. And I would encourage other guest speakers to accept invitations and to come in and be a part of this experience.